Have you ever wondered why some people seem completely immune to insults, criticism, and provocation, while the rest of us struggle to maintain our composure? What if I told you that these rare individuals possess a psychological superpower that Machiavelli himself considered both fascinating and deeply disturbing? Imagine someone insulting you to your face, criticizing your deepest values, or even betraying your trust, and you feeling nothing but calm curiosity, not because you're suppressing your anger or practicing some meditation technique, but because you've undergone a profound psychological transformation that makes other people's behavior completely irrelevant to your emotional state. Has this ever happened to you? Or are you more like the rest of us, caught in the emotional roller coaster of reactivity? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. In his clinical practice, Machiavelli documented rare individuals with what he called emotional impermeability, people who remained completely unbothered when provoked, unaffected by criticism, and eerily calm in situations that would send most of us into a rage. These weren't cold, unfeeling individuals. They weren't practicing detachment or emotional suppression. They had discovered something far more powerful, a psychological state that made them virtually untouchable. The case that revealed Machiavelli's most disturbing discovery began with a successful businessman in post-war Germany, 1919. Let's call him Heinrich. This man had built a steel empire from nothing, but his employees were terrified of him. Not because he was cruel or abusive, but because nothing could anger him. Insults simply bounced off him. Criticism made him curious rather than defensive. Even betrayal interested him rather than wounded him. His wife eventually brought him to Machiavelli, convinced something was wrong with her husband. "Doctor," she said, "my husband doesn't get upset about anything. Yesterday I told him I've been having an affair for 6 months. He asked me 3 questions. Was I happy? Did I need anything from him? And whether I wanted to continue our marriage or end it?" What Machiavelli discovered about this man would change his understanding of human psychology forever. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to learn might completely transform how you respond to difficult people and challenging situations in your own life. This wasn't just about controlling anger or practicing patience. Heinrich had undergone a specific psychological transformation that Machiavelli would later document in his most private case studies. A transformation that anyone could potentially achieve with the right understanding and practice. A transformation that makes you psychologically untouchable. What exactly did Machiavelli discover about these emotionally impermeable individuals? What psychological process had Heinrich mastered that allowed him to remain completely unbothered by others' actions? And most importantly, how can you develop this same level of emotional immunity? If you're ready to develop your own psychological immunity, subscribe to join thousands of others on this transformative journey. I share powerful insights like these that most people never discover. What Machiavelli found next was truly revolutionary. When he began his sessions with Heinrich, he expected to find a man who was emotionally numb, perhaps traumatized, or someone who had simply mastered the art of suppressing his feelings. But the hidden truth was far more fascinating. Heinrich wasn't suppressing anything at all. He hadn't disconnected from his emotions or built walls around his heart. Instead, he had undergone a profound inner transformation that Machiavelli would later call the shadow mirror effect. This psychological breakthrough changed the entire mindset of how we understand emotional triggers. "Doctor," Heinrich explained during one of their sessions, "when someone insults me or tries to hurt me, I don't see an attack. I see a mirror reflecting parts of myself I haven't fully understood yet." This revelation stunned Machiavelli. Heinrich had discovered that every person who angers you is actually showing you something about your own unconscious mind. The rude colleague who dismisses your ideas, they're reflecting your own fear of being inadequate. The friend who's always late, they're mirroring your need for control. The family member who criticizes your choices, they're showing you your own self-doubt. Heinrich explained how his journey toward this realization began 3 years earlier after experiencing a devastating business betrayal. His closest partner had stolen his biggest client and nearly destroyed his company. But instead of seeking revenge or falling into bitterness, the natural reactions most of us would have, Heinrich asked himself one powerful question. What part of me is this person reflecting? The answer revealed aspects of himself he had never confronted before. His partner's greed reflected Heinrich's own suppressed fear of poverty. His partner's dishonesty mirrored Heinrich's tendency to hide his true feelings. His partner's betrayal showed Heinrich his own capacity for selfishness in business dealings. Rather than projecting these shadow aspects onto others and blaming them for his pain, Heinrich had achieved what Machiavelli called psychological immunity. He could see other people's behavior as information about them, not attacks on him. This shift in perception freed him from the emotional roller coaster most of us ride throughout our lives. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic and explore exactly how Heinrich applied this principle in everyday situations. You see, Machiavelli didn't just document this discovery. He developed it into a practical method anyone could use, a method that could transform triggers of anger into teachers of wisdom. If you're resonating with this concept of seeing others as mirrors of your own unconscious, write in the comments, "I see the reflection." This extraordinary shift in Heinrich's perspective didn't happen overnight. The betrayal that could have destroyed both his business and his spirit instead became the catalyst for his remarkable transformation. When his partner absconded with his biggest client, a devastating blow that would have sent most entrepreneurs into a spiral of rage and revenge, Heinrich made a decision that would forever alter his journey. Instead of focusing outward on his partner's treachery, he turned his attention inward. What part of me is this person reflecting? This single question unlocked revelations that went far beyond the immediate situation. As Heinrich explored this question deeply, the hidden connections between his partner's actions and his own suppressed fears emerged with startling clarity. His greed, Heinrich told Machiavelli, was merely a reflection of my own hidden fear of poverty, a fear I'd never acknowledged even to myself. His deception mirrored how I often concealed my true feelings in business dealings. And his betrayal? That showed me my own capacity for putting self-interest above relationships when the stakes were high enough. These weren't comfortable realizations. Looking into this mirror required tremendous courage, but by facing these shadow aspects of himself instead of projecting them outward, Heinrich achieved what Machiavelli would later document as psychological immunity, perhaps the most powerful mental framework for emotional freedom ever discovered. This immunity wasn't about becoming numb or detached from others. Rather, it allowed Heinrich to see people's behavior as information about them, not attacks on himself. He could observe the most venomous criticism or the cruelest betrayal with genuine curiosity instead of reactive pain. He had broken free from the invisible chains that bind most of us to our emotional triggers. Fascinated by this discovery, Machiavelli began documenting the process that led to Heinrich's transformation. He called it the Shadow Integration Protocol, a structured approach that anyone could follow to develop their own psychological immunity. The protocol centered around 3 essential questions to ask yourself when someone triggers an emotional reaction in you. First, what trait in this person am I judging most harshly? Second, where do I exhibit the same trait, even in small or subtle ways? Third, What is this trigger trying to teach me about myself? Through this protocol, Machiavelli discovered that our most intense emotional reactions aren't random. They're precise mirrors reflecting the exact parts of ourselves we haven't fully acknowledged or integrated. The colleague whose arrogance infuriates you might be reflecting your own unrecognized pride. The friend whose neediness exhausts you could be mirroring your own unmet need for connection. Subscribe now to access more hidden psychological principles that can transform how you respond to difficult people and challenging situations forever. The brilliance of this approach lies in its ability to transform every trigger into a teacher and every difficult person into a guide on your path to self-awareness. As we explore the practical applications of this protocol and see how it worked in real people's lives, you might start recognizing your own reflection in those who trigger you most. If you've ever experienced a moment where someone's behavior triggered an emotional reaction that felt disproportionate to the situation, type in the comments, "I've met my mirror." Let me show you how Machiavelli's shadow integration protocol works. In real life, through the story of Sarah, a marketing manager who participated in one of Machiavelli's later studies. Sarah's breakthrough moment reveals the practical power of this mindset shift. Sarah came to Machiavelli feeling constantly frustrated and undermined by her colleague Tom, who had a habit of interrupting her during team meetings. Every time Tom cut her off mid-sentence, Sarah would feel a surge of anger that would linger for hours afterward. These interruptions were affecting her performance, her relationships at work, and even following her home at the end of each day. "I can't stand how he always needs to be the center of attention," she told Machiavelli during their first session. "It's as if what I have to say doesn't matter at all." Machiavelli guided Sarah through the shadow integration protocol, asking her to dig beneath her surface reaction. First, she identified exactly what trait she was judging in Tom: his apparent need for attention and recognition. The second question was more challenging. Where did she exhibit this same trait, even in small ways? Sarah's initial response was resistance. "I'm nothing like Tom. I respect others and wait my turn." But as she journeyed deeper into self-reflection, a revelation emerged. In social settings where she felt insecure, Sarah often dominated conversations, speaking at length about her accomplishments. The very behavior she despised in Tom was a shadow aspect of herself that she had never fully acknowledged. The third question, what this trigger was teaching her, unlocked a profound insight. Sarah realized her anger at Tom's interruptions wasn't really about Tom at all. It was frustration with her own attention-seeking behavior when feeling insecure, a pattern she had never fully owned. "Once I saw this connection," Sarah later reported, "something extraordinary happened. The next time Tom interrupted me in a meeting, instead of feeling that familiar surge of anger, I felt curiosity. I could see his interruption as an expression of his insecurity, not an attack on my worth." This shift in perception completely transformed their dynamic. Tom's interruptions continued initially, but they no longer had the power to disturb Sarah's inner state. She could respond with calm clarity rather than reactive emotion. And remarkably, within a few weeks, Tom's behavior toward her began to change as well. This is the true power of the shadow integration protocol. It transforms triggers into teachers. When we recognize that what bothers us most in others often reflects disowned aspects of ourselves, we gain freedom from emotional reactivity and develop deeper self-awareness. Our most difficult relationships become mirrors, reflecting precisely what we need to see about ourselves. But Machiavelli's research revealed something even more fascinating about people like Heinrich and Sarah, who had mastered this protocol. They hadn't just learned a psychological technique. They had accessed a state of consciousness that most humans never experience. If you've ever experienced a moment of sudden clarity about why someone triggers you, write in the comments. I've faced my shadow. Based on this revolutionary discovery, Machiavelli developed a technique that he called the observer protocol, a method designed to help people access the reaction gap and reclaim their power of choice. Though deceptively simple in its description, this protocol represented a profound psychological shift with far-reaching implications. The essence of the observer protocol is learning to step back and witness both the external trigger and your internal response, as if you were watching a movie. When someone criticizes you, instead of immediately becoming defensive or angry, you observe their words, their body language, their emotional state, and simultaneously you observe your own internal reactions without becoming identified with them. The key distinction, Machiavelli wrote in his notes, is between experiencing yourself as the reaction versus experiencing yourself as the awareness that notices the reaction. This subtle shift in perspective creates a revolution in your relationship with emotional triggers. You're no longer trapped inside the experience, helplessly carried away by emotional currents. You've created an inner vantage point from which to witness the entire drama unfolding, both the external trigger and your internal response, while maintaining your freedom to choose. Machiavelli documented case after case of individuals who mastered this technique and experienced remarkable transformations in their relationships and inner peace. One compelling example was Maria, a dedicated teacher who came to Machiavelli feeling constantly undermined by her school principal's harsh criticism. "Every time he criticizes my teaching methods," Maria explained, "I feel this immediate wave of defensiveness and anger. Before I know it, I'm either arguing with him or silently seething for the rest of the day." Machiavelli trained Maria in the observer protocol, teaching her to pause when triggered and step into the witness position. Within weeks, she reported a breakthrough moment. During a particularly critical evaluation, instead of becoming defensive, Maria was able to observe both the principal and her own rising emotions from a place of detached awareness. From this observer position, Maria could see what had been invisible before: the principal's own stress, the pressure he faced from the school board, his insecurity about maintaining standards. She could simultaneously witness her own feelings of inadequacy and need for approval without becoming consumed by them. This shift in perspective allowed her to respond with empathy rather than reactivity. Instead of defending herself or attacking back, she could acknowledge the principal's concerns while maintaining her sense of self-worth. The entire dynamic of their relationship began to transform. The power of the observer protocol lies in a fundamental insight. You are not your emotions. You are the consciousness that witnesses your emotions. When someone triggers anger in you, that anger is information, not identity. You can choose to examine it, act on it, or simply let it pass. If you've ever found yourself watching your own emotional reaction as if from a distance, type in the comments, "I am the observer." Heinrich had mastered this observer protocol so completely that he described himself as feeling psychologically transparent, as if other people's negativity, criticism, and attempts to provoke him simply passed through him like light through glass. He wasn't avoiding emotions or suppressing them. He had simply stopped identifying with every emotional impulse that arose. "When someone insults me now," Heinrich explained to Machiavelli, "I can see the feeling of offense arising within me. I notice it with interest. There's anger appearing, but I am no longer compelled to become that anger or act from it. It's as if I'm watching clouds pass across the sky of my awareness. They come, they go, but the sky itself remains unchanged." This psychological freedom created a remarkable shift in Heinrich's relationships and decision-making. Situations that would paralyze others with anxiety or rage became simple problems to be solved. People who could previously manipulate him through his emotions found their tactics suddenly ineffective. His business decisions became clearer, unclouded by emotional reactions or the need to prove himself. But Machiavelli's research revealed a fascinating and somewhat disturbing pattern among those who mastered this level of emotional impermeability. Many of them experienced a kind of existential shift that fundamentally changed their relationship with society. They often lost interest in the dramas that consumed most humans. The need to be right, to win arguments, to defend their egos, to prove their worth, or to seek validation from others. This made them incredibly powerful in one sense. They could navigate social and professional environments with remarkable effectiveness, unburdened by the emotional triggers that paralyzed others. But it also created a subtle isolation. They often found themselves feeling like observers of human behavior rather than full participants in the emotional exchanges that create connection. "Sometimes I feel like I'm watching a play," Heinrich confessed during one session. "Everyone around me seems caught in these intense emotional dramas that I can see through. They're fighting battles that don't actually exist outside their perceptions. It's both fascinating and lonely to see this so clearly." This revelation highlights one of the profound paradoxes of psychological development. Greater freedom sometimes creates greater distance. As individuals develop the capacity to step outside the reactive patterns that govern most human behavior, they may find themselves feeling somewhat separate from those still caught in these patterns. The journey of psychological liberation isn't simply about escaping emotional reactivity. It's about developing a new relationship with your emotions, one where they inform you without controlling you, where they add richness to your experience without dictating your choices, where they connect you to others without entangling you in their dramas. The Observer Protocol offers a path to this liberation, but it requires a fundamental shift in how you understand your relationship with your own consciousness. The journey begins with a simple but profound question. What would it be like to experience yourself not as your thoughts and emotions, but as the awareness in which they appear? If you've ever felt a sense of freedom when you stopped identifying with an emotion, write in the comments, "I am more than my emotions." While the Observer Protocol might sound complex in theory, Machiavelli discovered that most people could begin accessing the reaction gap within just a few weeks of consistent practice. The technique he developed was remarkably straightforward, involving 3 essential steps that anyone could implement in their daily interactions. The journey begins with a simple but powerful pause. When you feel yourself being triggered, that familiar surge of anger, defensiveness, or hurt, you intentionally interrupt the automatic process by taking a conscious breath. This micro moment of disruption is enough to create space in what would otherwise be an instantaneous reaction. In that space, you shift into observation mode. You witness both the external trigger and your internal response, as if watching a scene unfold. You notice the other person's words, their tone, their body language. Simultaneously, you observe your own emotional reaction arising, the tightening in your chest, the thoughts of defense or attack, the urge to respond, all without judgment or resistance. From this position of awareness, you access the freedom to choose. Rather than being driven by emotional impulse, you select your response based on your deeper values and what would serve the situation best. The transformation is profound. You're no longer a passive victim of your triggers, but the active author of your responses. The protocol doesn't eliminate emotions, Machiavelli noted. It liberates you from being controlled by them. But Machiavelli's research revealed something even more intriguing about individuals who had mastered emotional impermeability. Beyond the Observer Protocol, they had constructed what he called boundary fortresses around their psychological space. Unlike physical boundaries that separate you from others, these were invisible inner barriers that determined what could and couldn't affect your emotional state. Heinrich explained this concept to Machiavelli in a particularly revealing session. "Doctor," he said, "I've realized that people can only disturb my peace if I give them permission to do so. Their words, their actions, their emotions, these are all external events. They only become internal experiences if I choose to internalize them." This insight revolutionized Machiavelli's understanding of human psychology. Most people, he realized, had completely permeable psychological boundaries. They absorbed other people's emotions like sponges, took on their stress, and allowed external events to dictate their internal state. They had no filter between the outside world and their inner experience. Those with emotional impermeability, however, had learned to construct selective barriers. They could engage fully with the world without being at its mercy. They could care deeply about others without being controlled by them. They could receive feedback without feeling diminished by criticism. The mindset shift required to build these boundary fortresses represents one of the most powerful personal revolutions possible, the realization that your inner state belongs to you and no one else. If you've ever felt the freedom of not taking something personally that would have upset you in the past, write in the comments, "My boundaries are strengthening." This revelation about psychological boundaries fundamentally transformed Machiavelli's understanding of human psychology. He began to see that most people move through life with virtually no inner boundaries at all. They exist in a state of complete psychological permeability, absorbing other people's emotions as if they were their own, taking on the stress and anxiety of those around them, allowing external events and others' opinions to completely dictate their internal state. It's as if most people have no psychological skin, Machiavelli wrote in his private notes. They're completely exposed to every emotional wind that blows through their environment. But those who had developed emotional impermeability had constructed what Machiavelli called selective permeability, the ability to choose what they allowed to affect their inner state. Through extensive interviews and observations, Machiavelli documented 3 distinct types of psychological boundaries that these individuals had developed. The first was what he termed the relevance filter, a remarkable ability to distinguish between information that served their growth or goals and information that was irrelevant or harmful. Unlike most people who indiscriminately absorb every critique, opinion, or piece of feedback they receive, these individuals had trained themselves to ask, "Is this relevant to my journey? Does this serve my development?" They could acknowledge all information but only internalize what was useful. The second boundary Machiavelli identified was the ownership boundary, the ability to clearly distinguish between their emotions and other people's emotions. When someone projected anger, frustration, or disappointment toward them, they could recognize, "This is their emotion, not mine." This boundary allowed them to remain empathetic without taking on the emotional burdens of others. They could be with someone in pain without becoming their pain. The third and perhaps most powerful boundary was what Machiavelli called the identity fortress, having such a solid sense of self that external criticism or praise couldn't shake their core identity. Unlike most people whose self-concept fluctuates wildly based on others' opinions, these individuals maintained a stable inner anchor. They could hear feedback without hearing a judgment of their worth. They could receive criticism without experiencing it as a threat to their identity. Heinrich explained this mindset shift to Machiavelli. "I've realized that my worth isn't determined by others' opinions of me. Their words tell me about their perspective, not my value. This hidden truth has transformed how I experience criticism. It's now just information, not a verdict on who I am." The profound impact of these boundaries wasn't isolation from others, but a more authentic connection. By knowing where they ended and others began, these individuals could engage more genuinely, without the distortions of projection, absorption, and reactivity. If you've started to recognize when you're taking on emotions that don't belong to you, write in the comments, "These aren't my emotions." But Machiavelli discovered something paradoxical about these psychological boundaries that adds another dimension to the journey of emotional mastery. People who developed strong boundaries often found themselves becoming magnets for precisely the kinds of individuals they had learned to protect themselves against. Toxic personalities, emotional vampires, and chronically unstable people seemed inexplicably drawn to those with the strongest psychological boundaries. Heinrich described this phenomenon to Machiavelli with remarkable insight. "Doctor, I've noticed something strange since I stopped reacting to provocation. People seem to work harder to provoke me. It's as if my calm disturbs them more than anger ever could." Machiavelli came to understand this dynamic through the lens of psychological equilibrium. Emotionally reactive people, he realized, often use others' reactions to regulate their own emotional state. They provoke anger in order to feel powerful, create drama to feel alive, or trigger guilt to avoid responsibility. When someone, like Heinrich, refused to provide that regulation by remaining unmoved, it forced others to confront their own psychological instability. It's as if these people are unconsciously seeking a mirror for their chaos, Machiavelli noted. When they find someone who won't reflect it back to them, it creates both attraction and frustration. This revelation illuminated why the journey toward emotional impermeability often includes a phase where relationships become more challenging before they improve. As you develop stronger boundaries, you may temporarily disrupt the unconscious emotional bargains you've made with others. To navigate this challenging territory, Machiavelli developed the boundary fortress technique with 3 strategic elements that anyone could implement. The first was what he called the emotional firewall. Before entering any potentially triggering social situation, you consciously decide which emotions you're willing to experience and which you'll observe, but not absorb. You might decide, "I'll allow myself to feel compassion and curiosity, but not take on others' anxiety or anger." The second element was response selection. Pre-deciding how you'll handle common triggers rather than reacting spontaneously in the moment. Instead of being hijacked by emotion, you're executing a pre-planned response based on your values and what serves the situation best. The third component was the identity anchor, developing such a clear and stable sense of who you are that external opinions become interesting data rather than threats to your self-concept. Your worth is no longer tied to others' perceptions, but anchored in your own values and self-knowledge. Together, these elements create a psychological architecture that allows you to engage fully with others without being controlled by their emotions or behaviors. The boundary fortress doesn't isolate you from life's intensity. It gives you the freedom to experience it on your own terms. If you've noticed that certain people seem determined to break through your emotional boundaries, write in the comments, "I recognize the pattern." Let me illustrate the power of the boundary fortress technique through the story of David, a software engineer who came to Machiavelli feeling constantly overwhelmed by his demanding boss. Every criticism, every unreasonable deadline, every dismissive comment left David anxious, demoralized, and exhausted. He found himself thinking about work conflicts even during his personal time, unable to escape the emotional aftermath. Following Machiavelli's guidance, David implemented the boundary fortress method in a systematic way. Each morning before entering the office, he would take a few minutes to establish his emotional firewall. "Today, I'll allow myself to feel professional pride in my work and curiosity about feedback, but I won't absorb my boss's stress or impatience," he would decide. This simple practice created a filter between external events and his internal experience. He then pre-selected calm, professional responses to common triggers. When his boss criticized his work, instead of becoming defensive or anxious, he would respond with, "I appreciate the feedback. Could you help me understand exactly what needs to be improved?" This response selection freed him from the tyranny of emotional reactivity. Most importantly, David anchored his identity in his competence and growth rather than his boss's approval. His sense of worth was no longer tied to external validation, but to his own standards and development. "My value isn't determined by my boss's opinion of me," he reminded himself. "It's reflected in my commitment to excellence and continuous improvement." The transformation was remarkable. Within just a few weeks, David reported feeling psychologically untouchable at work. His boss's moods and criticism no longer affected his performance or peace of mind. But something even more unexpected happened. His boss's behavior toward him began to change. The constant criticism decreased, and a new respect seemed to emerge in their interactions. This shift revealed another paradox Machiavelli had observed. The stronger your boundaries, the more others respect them. People can sense psychological strength, and they typically adjust their behavior accordingly. But Machiavelli's most fascinating discovery about emotional impermeability went even deeper. He found that his patients had mastered what he called projection reversal, the ability to see through others' emotional attacks to the psychological wounds driving them. Heinrich demonstrated this principle during a session with Machiavelli after a business rival had publicly humiliated him, calling him a heartless profiteer who cares nothing for his workers. Instead of anger or defensiveness, Heinrich felt genuine curiosity. "Doctor," Heinrich explained, "this man's attack told me everything about his psychology and nothing about mine. His accusation of heartlessness revealed his own fear of being seen as uncaring. His focus on profit showed his own financial insecurity. His concern for workers exposed his guilt about his own treatment of employees." If you've ever glimpsed the insecurity behind someone's attack on you, write in the comments, "I see the projection." Machiavelli realized that Heinrich had developed what he called psychological X-ray vision, the remarkable ability to see through the surface of others' attacks to the underlying psychological dynamics driving them. This wasn't mere emotional detachment or intellectual analysis. It was a profound perceptual shift that allowed Heinrich to recognize that when someone attacks you, they're always telling you something about themselves, not about you. "This discovery disturbed me deeply," Machiavelli confessed in his private notes, "because it suggested that most human conflict isn't actually about what we think it's about. People aren't really fighting each other, they're fighting projections of their own unresolved issues onto each other." As Machiavelli continued his research, he documented this pattern repeatedly across hundreds of cases. Criticism about your appearance almost invariably comes from people deeply insecure about their own looks. Attacks on your success typically come from those frustrated with their own achievements. Judgments about your choices often reveal the critic's doubts about their own decisions. The hidden truth behind human conflict began to emerge with startling clarity. Most attacks are acts of projection rather than accurate assessments. We don't see others as they are. We see them through the lens of our own unhealed wounds, unacknowledged fears, and unintegrated shadow aspects. Once you can see these projections clearly, Heinrich explained, it becomes almost impossible to take personal attacks personally. How can I be offended when I can see so clearly the pain driving the other person's behavior? This transformation in perception doesn't lead to arrogance or dismissiveness. Quite the opposite. It typically creates profound compassion. When you can see through someone's attack to the wounded part of them that's really speaking, anger is replaced by understanding. Defensiveness gives way to curiosity about their journey and what might have created such pain. Heinrich described this mindset shift. "When someone attacks me now, I no longer see an enemy to fight. I see a wounded child, lashing out in pain. How can I be angry at a child for crying? Instead, I feel curious about what hurt them and whether I can help. This is the ultimate psychological immunity Machiavelli discovered. When you can see others' attacks as expressions of their pain rather than assessments of your worth, you become completely unbothered by their behavior. Their criticism, insults, and blame simply can't land because you understand the psychological mechanism behind them. The impact of this realization goes far beyond just avoiding emotional triggers. It fundamentally changes how you navigate relationships, conflict, and communication. You stop defending against projected accusations and start addressing the underlying fears and needs that are actually driving the interaction. This doesn't mean you accept abuse or mistreatment. Rather, you respond to it with clarity, seeing it for what it truly is, not a statement about you, but a revelation about the other person's internal state. If you've ever found yourself wondering what pain might be driving someone's hostile behavior toward you, write in the comments, "I see behind the attack." Machiavelli was particularly struck by the way Heinrich described this perceptual transformation. "When someone attacks me now," Heinrich explained, "I don't see an enemy or a threat. I see a wounded child lashing out in pain. Their criticism, their blame, their accusations, these aren't really about me at all. They're expressions of their own unhealed wounds." This perspective represents what Machiavelli came to recognize as the ultimate form of psychological immunity. When you can genuinely see others' attacks as expressions of their pain rather than assessments of your worth, you become completely unbothered by their behavior. The barbs simply can't penetrate because you understand the true nature of what's happening beneath the surface. "It's like having emotional X-ray vision," Heinrich told Machiavelli. "I can see through the attack to the fear driving it. And once I see that fear, how can I possibly take the attack personally? It would be like blaming a child for crying when they're hurt." This shift doesn't happen automatically, however. Recognizing this, Machiavelli developed what he called the projection reversal technique, a practical method anyone could use to see through attacks to the projections behind them. The technique involves 3 diagnostic questions that transform your relationship. With criticism and conflict, when someone attacks you, instead of reacting defensively, you pause and ask yourself, first, what quality or characteristic in me is this person attacking? Second, where might they struggle with this same quality in themselves? And third, what pain or fear might be driving this attack? The revelation of this approach is that it completely transforms your response, from defensive to compassionate, from reactive to understanding. Instead of fighting back against an attack, you're able to see the humanity behind it. Lisa, a graphic designer who worked with Machiavelli, demonstrated the power of this technique when a client harshly criticized her work as completely unprofessional and amateur. Initially devastated by the critique, Lisa applied the projection reversal questions. What are they attacking? My professionalism. Where might they struggle with this same quality? She reflected on previous conversations where the client had mentioned feeling like an imposter in their industry. What pain or fear might be driving this? Perhaps a fear that their own lack of professionalism will be exposed. This insight transformed Lisa's response. Instead of taking the criticism personally or becoming defensive, she could see it as the client's projection of their own professional insecurities. She addressed their concerns professionally while maintaining her inner peace and self-worth. The journey to mastering projection reversal involves a fundamental shift in how you interpret others' behavior. Rather than assuming that what people say about you is true, you recognize that their perceptions are filtered through their own wounds, fears, and projections. Their criticism often reveals more about their internal landscape than it does about your reality. If you've ever caught yourself reacting defensively to criticism before considering what might be driving the other person's behavior, write in the comments, "I'm learning to reverse the Projection. Despite the powerful psychological freedom that comes with mastering projection reversal, Machiavelli observed an unexpected and somewhat troubling side effect in his patients. As they developed the ability to see through others' psychological defenses, many began experiencing a profound sense of isolation from those around them. This transformation in perspective, while liberating, sometimes created a subtle barrier between them and others. Heinrich confessed this challenge to Machiavelli during a particularly revealing session. "Doctor," he said with a hint of sadness, "sometimes I feel like I'm the only adult in a world of hurt children. I can see everyone's pain so clearly, their defenses, their projections, their unconscious fears, that I struggle to take any of their behavior seriously anymore. How can I feel truly connected to people when I can see the psychological mechanisms driving their every reaction?" This revelation highlighted one of the hidden consequences of deep psychological insight. Once you develop the ability to see through the surface of human interaction to the unconscious dynamics beneath, ordinary relationships can begin to feel somewhat theatrical. You're witnessing the unfolding of psychological patterns rather than engaging with others as equals. It's like watching a play, where you can see both the characters and the actors simultaneously. Heinrich explained. You understand why everyone is saying their lines. What childhood wounds are speaking through them, what fears are driving their behavior. But that understanding creates distance. Machiavelli recognized this as a crucial crossroads in the journey toward emotional impermeability. The ability to see through projections could either lead to compassionate connection or psychological detachment. The difference lay not in the insight itself, but in how one held that insight. The danger, Machiavelli wrote, is not in seeing others' wounds clearly, but in forgetting that you too are wounded, that you too project, that you too act from unconscious patterns at times. The moment you believe you've transcended the human condition while others remain trapped in it, true connection becomes impossible. The challenge for those who master projection reversal is to maintain humility alongside insight. To remember that seeing through others' defenses doesn't place you above them, but offers you an opportunity to connect more authentically by recognizing the shared humanity beneath those defenses. Heinrich eventually found his way through this isolation by shifting his relationship with what he was seeing. Rather than viewing others' psychological patterns with detachment or superiority, he learned to use his insight as a bridge to deeper understanding and compassion. Everyone is doing the best they can with the consciousness they currently have, he told Machiavelli. I was once caught in the same reactive patterns I now see in others. Seeing their patterns doesn't make me better. It simply means I've walked a bit further along a path we're all traveling. If you've ever felt a sense of distance from others after gaining insight into psychological dynamics, write in the comments. Insight can create distance. Machiavelli's research into emotional impermeability ultimately led him to what was perhaps his most profound and transformative discovery. Beyond the shadow mirror, beyond the reaction gap, beyond psychological boundaries and projection reversal, he identified what he called emotional alchemy, the remarkable ability to transform every trigger, every difficulty, and every challenge into psychological gold. His patients hadn't merely learned to avoid being triggered or to observe their reactions dispassionately. They had developed something far more powerful, the capacity to use every emotional disturbance as fuel for their own psychological evolution. Heinrich explained this mindset revelation to Machiavelli in a session that would fundamentally change our understanding of human potential. "Doctor," he said, "I've undergone a complete transformation in how I see difficult people. I no longer view them as problems to avoid or manage. I see them as teachers, bringing me exactly the lessons I need for my growth." This statement encapsulated what made emotional alchemy so revolutionary. Most people spend their lives trying to minimize discomfort, avoid triggers, and escape challenging situations. But Heinrich had discovered that these very experiences contained the raw materials for extraordinary personal development. The more someone can trigger me, Heinrich explained, the more valuable they are to my development. Their power to disturb my peace shows me exactly where I still have work to do, exactly which shadow aspects I haven't fully integrated, exactly which wounds I haven't completely healed. This perspective represented a complete reversal of normal human psychology. Most of us organize our lives around avoiding pain and seeking comfort. We create elaborate strategies to escape triggers, difficult people, and challenging situations. We construct social bubbles, avoid certain topics, and steer clear of those who might disturb our emotional equilibrium. But Heinrich's journey showed a radical alternative. Instead of avoiding triggers, he actively sought them out as opportunities for growth. Instead of seeing difficult people as enemies to be defeated or avoided, he saw them as unconscious allies in his psychological development. The person who could most easily disturb his peace became his most valuable teacher. When someone criticizes me now, Heinrich told Machiavelli, my first thought isn't how do I defend myself, but rather what can this teach me about myself? I'm actually grateful for the mirror they're holding up, even if they don't realize they're doing it. This approach transformed every potential source of suffering into an opportunity for evolution. Nothing could truly harm Heinrich because he had learned to extract value from even the most painful experiences. This wasn't mere positive thinking or reframing, it was a fundamental shift in how he metabolized difficult experiences, transmuting them into wisdom and strength. If you've ever found yourself learning and growing more from your challenges than your comforts, write in the comments, "Pain becomes my teacher." Machiavelli realized that what Heinrich had discovered represented the ultimate stage of emotional impermeability. It wasn't just about remaining unbothered by others' behavior or seeing through their projections. It was about actively transforming every challenge, criticism, and attack into fuel for psychological advancement. The process Heinrich described was remarkably methodical. When triggered by someone, instead of merely observing his reaction or maintaining boundaries, he would immediately shift into a learning orientation. What is this person teaching me about myself? What weakness are they exposing that I need to strengthen? What shadow aspect are they forcing me to confront? This approach transformed every interaction into an opportunity for evolution. A colleague's criticism became a chance to develop greater resilience. A friend's betrayal offered insights into his own attachment patterns. A competitor's aggression revealed areas where he could cultivate more inner security. I've realized, Heinrich explained to Machiavelli, that every person who disturbs my peace is actually revealing exactly what I need to develop next. They're like guides appearing at precisely the right moment in my journey, pointing to the exact areas where I still have room to grow. What Machiavelli found most remarkable about this stage of development was that it created individuals who were nearly impossible to manipulate, control, or defeat emotionally. They had discovered a hidden truth that transformed every potential vulnerability into a source of strength. External validation could no longer inflate them because they didn't need it. They had developed an internal compass for their worth. External criticism couldn't deflate them because they used it as information for growth rather than as a judgment of their value. Even deliberate attempts to provoke or hurt them simply became more material for their ongoing transformation. It's as if these individuals have discovered psychological judo. Machiavelli noted, the harder someone pushes against them, the more energy they have to redirect toward their own development. This level of psychological freedom represents a profound inversion of how most people relate to challenging experiences. Rather than being diminished by difficulties, those who master emotional alchemy are enhanced by them. Rather than avoiding triggers, they welcome them as catalysts for growth. You already know this truth intuitively. The moments that have shaped you most profoundly weren't the comfortable, easy times. They were the challenges, the heartbreaks, the failures, and the criticisms that forced you to evolve. Emotional alchemy simply brings this unconscious process into full awareness, allowing you to intentionally transform every trigger into psychological gold. The freedom this creates is extraordinary. When external validation cannot inflate you because you don't need it, and external criticism cannot deflate you because you use it for growth, you have achieved a level of psychological sovereignty that few ever experience. You have become emotionally invulnerable, not through armor or detachment, but through the alchemy of turning every challenge into wisdom. If you've ever found yourself thinking, this difficult experience is actually making me stronger, type in the comments, I am the alchemist. Machiavelli documented this emotional alchemy as involving 3 distinct transformation processes that work together to create this remarkable state of psychological immunity. Understanding these processes reveals the practical pathway to developing this ability in your own life. The first transformation process is what Machiavelli called trigger mining, actively extracting valuable insights from every person who disturbs your peace. Instead of avoiding difficult people or merely managing your reactions to them, you approach each triggering encounter with curiosity. What specific wisdom is this person bringing you? What particular insight could only come through this challenging interaction? The second process is shadow integration, using others' behavior as a mirror to identify and heal your own psychological wounds. When someone's actions trigger you intensely, you recognize that they're reflecting aspects of yourself that you haven't fully acknowledged or integrated. By facing these shadow elements directly, you gradually become less reactive because there's nothing left to trigger. The third process is strength synthesis, the systematic conversion of every discovered weakness into a developed strength. Each vulnerability that others expose becomes a focus area for deliberate growth. Instead of hiding your weaknesses or defending against having them revealed, you welcome the revelation as an opportunity to transform that precise area into a new source of power. Let me show you the transformative impact of emotional alchemy through the story of Marcus, a sales manager who came to Machiavelli feeling constantly triggered by what he perceived as his team's laziness and constant excuses. Their apparent lack of drive infuriated him and led to a cycle of frustration, anger, and increasingly authoritarian management that only worsened the situation. Instead of just managing his reactions or setting better boundaries, Marcus applied the emotional alchemy approach. He began by asking himself, what is their behavior teaching me? What am I learning about myself through this? Trigger? The insights that emerged transformed his understanding. He realized he was projecting his own extraordinarily high standards onto others without understanding their individual motivations. The weakness this exposed wasn't in his team. It was in his inability to inspire rather than demand, to connect rather than control. Marcus used this revelation not merely to feel better about the situation, but to develop an entirely new set of leadership skills. He studied motivation psychology, learned to connect with his team members' personal goals, and developed approaches that aligned their intrinsic motivations with the company's objectives. Within months, his team's performance dramatically improved, not because Marcus had forced them to work harder, but because he had transformed his trigger into the catalyst for his greatest professional development. The very quality that once infuriated him had become the doorway to his evolution as a leader. This example reveals the extraordinary power of emotional alchemy. The triggers that once controlled you become the raw materials for your growth. The people who once disturbed your peace become your greatest teachers. If you've ever transformed a challenge into an opportunity for growth, write in the comments, every trigger holds a gift. But Machiavelli's research also uncovered a shadow side to emotional alchemy that required careful navigation. He noticed that some individuals who mastered these transformation processes sometimes developed a subtle form of psychological superiority that actually undermined their connections with others. There's a dangerous threshold in this journey, Machiavelli wrote in his notes, where individuals become so focused on their own psychological evolution that they lose empathy for those still struggling with basic emotional regulation. They begin to view others not as fellow humans on the same path, but as case studies in unconsciousness. Heinrich himself confessed to experiencing this shadow aspect of his development. Sometimes, Doctor, he admitted, during a particularly candid session, I feel as if I'm conducting a psychology experiment rather than living a human life. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to study human nature rather than to connect with another person. I observe reactions, analyze projections, and extract lessons. But I find myself feeling increasingly distant from the very people I'm engaging with. This revelation highlighted what Machiavelli came to recognize as the final and perhaps most crucial challenge of emotional impermeability: maintaining your humanity while achieving psychological transcendence. The goal, he realized, wasn't to become invulnerable through detachment or superiority. It was to become what modern psychology would later term anti-fragile, not merely resilient against challenges, but actually strengthened and made more compassionate through them. True immunity, Machiavelli wrote, requires accepting both strength and vulnerability, both wisdom and confusion, both transcendence and embodiment. The master isn't the one who escapes the human condition, but the one who embraces it fully while maintaining their center. This insight reflects one of the most profound paradoxes of deep psychological work. The more aware you become of psychological patterns and projections, the more you risk creating distance between yourself and others. The very clarity that liberates you can also isolate you if not held within a larger context of shared humanity. Heinrich's journey through this final challenge required him to reconnect with his own vulnerability, to remember that his psychological development wasn't about escaping the human condition, but experiencing it more fully and authentically. He had to learn that true mastery wasn't about rising above others, but about walking alongside them with greater awareness. The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life, Machiavelli wrote. Complete immunity required accepting both your strength and your vulnerability, both your wisdom and your confusion. The journey wasn't about becoming superhuman, but about becoming more fully human. This understanding transformed Heinrich's approach to his relationships and his inner development. Rather than using his psychological insight to distance himself from others or to feel superior to them, he began using it to connect more deeply, to understand others more completely, and to serve them more effectively. If you've ever noticed yourself feeling superior to others because of your personal growth or psychological understanding, write in the comments. Awareness without compassion creates distance. Machiavelli's research ultimately revealed that the highest stage of emotional impermeability wasn't about creating distance or achieving personal invulnerability. It was what he called compassionate immunity, using your psychological strength to help others rather than to separate yourself from them. This final stage represented the true culmination of the journey Heinrich had been on. After mastering the shadow mirror, the reaction gap, boundary fortresses, projection reversal, and emotional alchemy, He discovered that true mastery wasn't about escaping the human condition, but about engaging with it from a position of inner freedom and genuine care. The ultimate transformation, Machiavelli wrote, isn't away from humanity, but toward a deeper embodiment of it. The master isn't separate from others, but serves them from a place of unshakable center. Machiavelli called this final stage the compassionate warrior, someone who could remain untriggered while still caring deeply about others, someone who could witness pain without becoming consumed by it, someone who could stand in the fire of intense emotions without being burned. Heinrich's evolution into this compassionate warrior happened gradually. In the early stages of his development, his immunity had created a subtle distance between him and others. People found his unshakable calm unsettling, even threatening. They sensed his psychological strength, but also felt somehow diminished by it, as if his invulnerability highlighted their reactivity. Through his work with Machiavelli, Heinrich came to understand that true emotional immunity wasn't complete if it only protected him. I realized, Heinrich reflected during one of their final sessions, that real strength means creating space for others to feel their emotions without judgment while maintaining my own center. It's not about transcending emotions, but about holding them with wisdom. The revelation transformed Heinrich's relationships. When his wife expressed frustration or pain, instead of merely remaining unmoved in his psychological fortress, he learned to fully witness her feelings without being destabilized by them. He could hold space for her, experience while remaining grounded in his own center. When his employees brought him problems, he could listen with complete presence without taking on their stress. He became a psychological container for others, someone who could be with them in their reactivity without either absorbing it or dismissing it. This is the profound paradox Machiavelli discovered about ultimate emotional immunity. It requires maintaining your humanity, not transcending it. The compassionate warrior can feel others' pain without suffering from it, can witness others' chaos without becoming chaotic, and can offer support without becoming depleted. Heinrich's journey revealed that emotional impermeability isn't about becoming cold or detached. It's about becoming so psychologically strong that you can remain warm and connected even in the midst of others' emotional storms. If you've experienced moments where you could stay present with someone's intense emotions without being overwhelmed by them, write in the comments, "I am becoming the compassionate warrior." From his extensive observations, Machiavelli developed a practical approach that embodied the compassionate warrior's stance, what he called emotional aikido. This martial arts-inspired technique focused not on blocking or absorbing others' emotional energy, but on skillfully redirecting it toward more constructive channels. Much like the physical discipline of Aikido uses an opponent's momentum against them, emotional Aikido involves receiving someone's emotional force and transforming it into something beneficial. When someone brings you anger, you redirect it towards solutions rather than feeding it with your own defensive energy. When someone brings you sadness, you transform it into compassion rather than drowning in sympathy. When someone brings you fear, you alchemize it into wisdom rather than contaminating yourself with anxiety. The master of emotional Aikido, Machiavelli wrote, doesn't resist or fight against emotional energy that only strengthens it. Instead, they receive it, redirect it, and transform it into something that serves both parties. Heinrich mastered this approach so completely that people in his business and personal life began instinctively seeking him out during their worst emotional crises. His presence alone seemed to have a calming effect on others' inner storms, but he achieved this not through emotional detachment or spiritual bypassing, but through emotional mastery, now feeling everything but being controlled by nothing. There's a profound difference, Heinrich explained to Machiavelli, between numbing yourself to others' emotions and being able to fully feel them without being destabilized by them. I've learned to meet intensity with presence rather than with resistance or absorption. In his final notes on Heinrich's remarkable journey, Machiavelli revealed what he considered the ultimate secret of emotional impermeability. He has learned to love others, humanity, while remaining untouchable by their chaos. This is perhaps the highest achievement of human psychology, complete vulnerability combined with complete invulnerability. This paradoxical state represents the true culmination of the path we've been exploring. The businessman who couldn't be bothered had become Machiavelli's greatest case study in human psychological potential. Heinrich proved that emotional immunity isn't about becoming cold, detached, or superior. It's about becoming so psychologically strong that you can remain warm, engaged, and connected even amid the most intense emotional storms. I've discovered, Heinrich shared in their final session, that true strength isn't about what can't touch you. It's about what you can touch without being changed by it. I can now be with anyone's pain, anger, or fear without either shutting down or being overwhelmed. I can feel everything and still choose my response. This revelation points to a revolutionary truth about human potential. We are not destined to remain victims of our emotional reactions. With the right understanding and practice, anyone can develop the psychological immunity that makes others' behavior irrelevant to their inner peace. If you recognize this profound paradox of strength through vulnerability in your own experience, write in the comments, "Strong enough to be vulnerable." Machiavelli's disturbing discovery about people who never get angry revealed the ultimate truth about human nature. We are not victims of our emotional reactions. With the right understanding and practice, anyone can develop the psychological immunity that makes others' behavior irrelevant to your inner peace. The path Heinrich traveled, from shadow integration through boundary fortresses, projection reversal, and emotional alchemy to finally becoming a compassionate warrior, represents the complete journey of psychological development that Machiavelli believed every human could achieve. You've just explored the psychological techniques that Machiavelli documented in his most private case studies, the shadow mirror that transforms triggers into teachers, the reaction gap that gives you choice over your responses, the boundary fortress that protects your psychological space, the projection reversal that helps you see through others' attacks, the emotional alchemy that turns challenges into growth, and finally, the compassionate warrior who maintains humanity while achieving immunity. If you found value in these insights, I'd love for you to join our community of psychological explorers by subscribing to the channel. Each week, we dive deep into hidden principles that can transform your relationship with yourself and others. If this journey resonated with you, leave a comment saying, "I'm claiming my psychological immunity." I read every comment and would love to hear which concept impacted you most. Your like on this video helps others discover these transformative ideas that often remain hidden in the shadows of psychology. And if you're ready to take the next step in your psychological development, there's a video right here about how to remain calm in any situation that builds perfectly on what you've just learned. Click and continue this journey of transformation with me there. Remember, the question isn't whether you can develop emotional immunity. The question is whether you're ready to claim the psychological power that Machiavelli proved belongs to you.